I'm gonna do Isle of Dogs. The Fantastic Mr. Fox 2 is a charming yet visceral story set in a somewhat caricatured future Chinese city by the name of Nagasaki. Nagasaki's dog population has been dumped on a landmass off of its coast by the name of Garbage Town after a sickness outbreak, setting us up with an anti-dog society being led by the anti-dog Asian Gru from Despicable Me and his major domo, Evil Alfred. At first glance, this is a standard adventure movie following a young boy by the name of Super Nintendo on his quest to save his dog Stripe. I think some people might cling to this idea and miss the dynamic to the movie that I found very compelling. There's no protagonist within this movie. Fantastic Mr. Fox 2 is not about a boy on his quest. Fantastic Mr. Fox 2 is about the involvement of a selection of characters in saving the corrupted city of Nagasaki along with its dog population. Our primary characters are Super Nintendo, Soot and the Paw Patrol, Nancy from Illinois, a nerdy kid with glasses, and Yoko Ono as Yoko Ono. I wonder how many people picked up on that while they were watching. No one of these characters holds the spotlight as the true protagonist in my eyes. An initial problem with this is that not having a true protagonist means having the audience walk away from the movie without feeling an intimate connection with any one character. I didn't resonate specifically with any of these characters, but I did resonate with their journey. The closest to a protagonist that I could draw was Soot. He had the most character development, and nobody else really changes throughout the movie, which is part of why it's really hard to connect with them. You don't go through anything with them, you go through the collective adventure with everybody. I do feel that before I go anywhere else, I need to state specifically that the cast for this movie was phenomenal. Two standout performances for me were those of Bryan Cranston as Soot and Edward Norton as the dinosaur, though I do commend the whole of the Paw Patrol for their performances because I absolutely adored their characters and relationships. Fantastic Mr. Fox 2 is simple and sweet enough for a younger audience to enjoy, though I believe that a lot of the movie's themes accompanied by Wes Anderson's approach makes it better suited to an older audience. At points, Fantastic Mr. Fox 2 can get a little dark and serious, but it never stays that way for too long. Things keep moving at a brisk enough pace to keep things feeling fresh and interesting in a way that I feel also directs it further from being a kid's movie, harder for them to digest, whilst generally just making it a more enjoyable experience on the whole. I don't enjoy the hovering around in one place for too long, an issue that I feel a lot of movies have. Like I said, Fantastic Mr. Fox 2 is about the journey and not the characters. In this case, it's the journey that we're seeing develop throughout, and I enjoyed it very much. There were some twists that I felt were inevitable from the moment I saw the first trailer, and I felt them hovering over me for the entire first half of the movie. At around the halfway mark, my suspicions were confirmed, and I was about ready to mark it down for something that I felt was a little cliched. But then my boy Wes took the twists and added some turns that made me realize I wasn't working my toes enough. What I was worried would be a stale and predictable story had enough development to feel unique and fresh, without feeling unnatural, filling in story blanks rather than needlessly adding to them, whilst also cooling and effectively commanding the viewer's attention without being overly complex. Another component of the movie that I feel is executed in a way less accessible to a younger audience was the comedy. I'm a passionate fan of anti-humor, the lack of a punchline being particularly enjoyable, and finding the humor in the nature of a situation rather than a particular action or punchline. Fantastic Mr. Fox 2 executes its comedy incredibly well. There's very little attention given to the jokes being made throughout. They just happen and things keep rolling. Characters will say and do subtle things that invoke laughter out of the blue, rather than relying on setting things up for a punchline to be delivered. It's the characters' mannerisms and behaviors alongside the things that they experience that create the comedy, which feels far more natural and enjoyable than if the jokes would be orchestrated through dialogue. It also had a good number of recurring jokes that I couldn't not find funny. The casual tone of the characters' dialogue accompanied by the near-apocalyptic setting in which the scene would take place made it hard for me to not enjoy the conversations that characters would have. The very first thing that reeled me into wanting to see this movie was the visual style. I'm sure I'm not alone in believing that Fantastic Mr. Fox was a visually captivating movie. The environments and cinematography, accompanied by the bizarre behaviors of its characters in this stop-motion format, made for visuals that I couldn't look away from. Fantastic Mr. Fox 2 perfects this format with another round of stunning environments, completely unique from Mr. Fox. The aesthetic of Garbage Town changes as the characters travel, and we see a lot of beautiful scenes as Anderson uses the setting to its fullest potential. The use of stop-motion in tandem with Anderson's usual style is a perfect fit for Fantastic Mr. Fox 2. The slightly stunted and stuttery nature of the stop-motion lends to the atmosphere of Garbage Town through its inhabitants, an island of sick and stray dogs that, living in a harsh environment, would likely have very jittery and scrappy behavior. Meanwhile, Anderson's own approach to filmmaking echoes the city of Nagasaki and radiates conformity and surgical precision. The almost robotic behaviors of the characters, the cleanliness of the shots, symmetry and care for detail that we see in many of Anderson's works lends itself to these themes. These two aspects of Anderson's style work together to make these two halves of the setting into a world just strange enough to be incredibly compelling to explore. soundtrack for Isle of Dogs is incredible, offering up an array of thematic orchestral pieces to tie together the Chinese setting that do a great job of getting you excited for the developments of the movie, alongside some softer, more Western tracks that help me to empathize with the Paw Patrol on their adventure. Generally, the soundtrack was easy on the ears and did its job well without being too in your face, which for me is the sign of a great soundtrack. I mean, it's hard for me to really speak on a subject like this because I'm a straight white boy who comes from a rich family. There was some backlash from people who viewed this movie as cultural appropriation rather than an homage to Chinese culture. I feel like people lose sight of what the movie is and what it's about when they feel this. For me personally, I could see that the Chinese society was played up. It wasn't a realistic representation. The reasons for this fall in line with Why the Dog's Barking is translated for us, but the Chinese isn't. The largely Western, non-Chinese fluent audience of this movie would not be able to follow the Chinese dialogue without it being translated or subtitled, as I couldn't. But that's because we weren't supposed to. When translated, the dialogue is nothing amazing. It's just some mediocre Chinese that fits the story. But without it, we're still able to understand the story completely. I'm far from the first person to state that we can't understand the Chinese dialogue because the dogs can't in the movie. But I feel that this carries across to all aspects of the human civilization in Fantastic Mr. Fox 2. Their entire culture is caricatured and exaggerated because to a dog, all of these things are so meaningless and bizarre. From a dog's perspective, the culture of these humans would seem so much crazier than it does to the humans themselves, and we're seeing this movie told from the dog's perspective, as indicated by the dialogue. But I probably just said a lot of racist things without realizing. I've lost all of my pride. I wouldn't say that this movie was flawless. There were a few things that I felt bothered me enough to shave points off in my books. An example for me personally would be Nancy from Illinois' character. This foreign exchange student exists for one reason that I do enjoy and two reasons that I do not. She acts as a party driving the story towards the end goal of saving Nagasaki and the dogs. She has her own motivations for doing so in the form of her own dog and her role in the school newspaper trying to uncover a conspiracy. However, it's once we get beyond this that I start to take issue with her. She exists as a medium to break the movie's language rules by being a primarily American-speaking character. This didn't bother me too much, but it felt a little sly at some stages and played on my mind afterwards. For the most part, they use this effectively, though the second issue is the romance component. Fantastic Mr. Fox 2 features its share of romance subplots. Our boy Soot has a little romance subplot of his own which plays into his character development during the movie. However, the romance between Nancy from Illinois and Super Nintendo is seemingly needless. I could have gone through the entire movie without that romance and I would have enjoyed it just as much, and in fact I would have maybe been more keen for a romance to bloom if it hadn't. Super Nintendo delivers a speech that Nancy from Illinois translates in which he refers to her as attractive. I thought this was funny given her reaction, and it could have stood alone and hinted at a romance between the two in the future. I likely would have left the movie wanting a relationship between these two characters as opposed to wishing that they had just left that dynamic alone. It doesn't ruin the movie in any measure, but I have very particular views on adding romance aspects to stories. It needs to be done very well. I need to see why these characters are right for each other so that I can root for them. No real reason is given here. Nancy falls for Nintendo because he's going on a mission to save his dog. Then they wind up together. That's it. Personally, I'm not into that, but some people may have wanted to see a romance between these two characters and to each his own. Aside from this, there were a couple of components that didn't seem like they were entirely logical. Asian Gru's master plan was to replace dogs with robot dogs instead of with cats, an animal that he is plastered with imagery of, which sort of put a sour taste in my mouth about the whole evil scheme. Besides that, I don't really have any complaints. I walked into the movie excited to see what Wes and the gang had in store for me, and I walked out with a smile on my face feeling very satisfied. The ending was a victory that made me feel like it was a worthwhile journey, with enough sacrifice for me to feel like it wasn't a cop-out. I don't have any kind of rating scale in mind because I'm generally very bad at giving appropriate ratings, but I'll summarize my review with, very nice, but please stop making it about politics. I won't hurt you, I won't hurt you, I won't hurt you, I won't hurt you. I'm an untouched diamond that's golden and brilliant without illumination. Your mouth's a constellation, the stars are in your eyes. I'll take a spaceship and try and go